Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Reactor Microsoft User Group session with the title, Not Your Other Data Center, 10 Tips for a Successful Azure Migration. I'm your host for this evening, or at least evening if you're from Australia, dialing in from Australia, or if anybody's dialing in from anywhere else in the world, welcome and glad to have you here. My name is David O'Brien. There's a tiny picture of me because we're not doing video, I think. So just to give you a face to this voice and this very interesting accent, just to make sure that you don't spend the next 45 or so minutes wondering where this accent is from. It's German Scottish, and we moved to Australia around 6-ish years ago. So it's a bit of a blend between a lot of different accents. That out of the way, I'm also not just a very big blend of lots of nationalities, but also an Azure MVP for almost 6 years now, I think. Yeah, about 6 years. I've been working in and around cloud for almost 10 years, I would say. And about 2 years ago, I started a company called Xyrus. We do obviously a lot of cloud consulting all around Azure. So if you need to know anything about doing cloud right, the right way, then happy to have a chat to you. If you want to get in touch with me, there's my Twitter handle at David_O'Brien. My personal blog is cloud-right.com. I blog about lots of infrastructure as code and cloud principles, governance, security, in general, just how to do cloud right. And if you're interested in what Xyrus itself does, there's the address as well. We are just fair warning, we are just currently updating our website. All right, with that, I'm gonna go straight into why are we here? So, and you probably want to know a lot about how to make your journey successful. So I want to always make my customers, the people that I work with and for, obviously very successful. And the success doesn't necessarily just come from we were able to migrate all our servers over to Azure, or we now have a working application, but it's also if it was fun, right? So we want to make our Azure initiative a successful one and a fun one. And ideally, I also want to make you or your team overall the hero of your company. Because I believe that if there's no ownership or you don't feel ownership of that success, of that what has been done, then really you don't really buy into the success of it, or even sometimes the failures, and it becomes a bit of a finger pointing game. So that's why I always say we want to make sure that it's successful, fun, and because if it was fun, then we also want to make it or do it again, right? So that's usually the premise of or the starting point with these Azure projects that I take with our customers. So I said we've got 10 tips, and the very first one, and it's not a coincidence that it is the first one, it's people. Yeah, we need to focus on people. We need to see them as the most important point and the most important topic when it comes to a project like this, or actually any project, right? We've got the Formula One here as an example. If even one of them wouldn't know what was going on, or if somebody just forgot to tell somebody that instead of one specific type of tires, we're now using a different type of tires, then the whole project would fail, right? So it's important that we focus on the people and make sure that we explain what is going to happen when we now go and move to the cloud, migrate things to Azure. What does that actually mean? So does everybody understand why this is even happening, right? It's good to say, well, we're migrating to the cloud, but we need to understand why. Another aspect is we should really, in order to be successful, select internal advocates for this project, for this initiative. It's always good to have an external party come in, but thinking back to what I just said previously on the previous slide around buy-in, it's much more powerful if you've got an internal advocate or hero or whatever you want to call them, because they can then drive this project from within. And they don't even have to be super technical. It could even be a junior person with a lot of clout in the company, or somebody who's really keen to learn and is really excited about what is going to happen in this project. And why is that? Because excitement is contagious. Right? If one of the internal people, one of you has some sort of success with something, then you're very likely to tell other people about that success. And that success spreads and people get excited about what is going to happen. It's also very, very important to assign responsibilities. Yeah, if nobody feels responsible for anything, then nothing is really ever going to happen. Again, back to the example here about the Formula One. If people would just rock up and, well, I don't really know what my responsibility is. I'm gonna pick this tire up and let's see what happens. It's obviously not going to be successful. The last one on this one is also the user training. It's always good to see people being told, okay, you're now responsible for this or you're responsible for that. But people also forget the training aspect. Yeah, that could be pair programming, that could be formal training, that could be something like online training like Microsoft Learn or Pluralsight or a cloud guru or whatever else is out there. It's important to understand what do my team members already know and how are we going to train them. So we usually spend quite a bit of time identifying and understanding what the people aspect of a project looks like. The next one is usually a lot harder than just focusing on people. People always come with a lot of baggage, obviously, because everybody has their own opinions and experiences. And these usually, they shift over to this topic now. So mental paradigm shift is a very, very big one. I call the session Not Your Other Data Center. There are stickers around, there are articles around calling Azure just another data center or the cloud is just another data center. And while technically, if you actually look into the cloud, that might be true, but really cloud is not a location, it's really a way of doing things. And that means we have to think differently about the workloads and applications that we put into the cloud and how we interact with the cloud. It's not just another hypervisor platform. It really is a different way of doing things. And that means that resources and our patterns of how we do things, they need to be reviewed all the time. By all the time, I don't mean on a daily basis, but let's say every couple of weeks or every 2 months, once a quarter, as long as there's some sort of review of what you're doing and what you have been doing, and comparing that to what is now a good way of doing things, that's important, because in the cloud, things constantly change, and that's good. But we also need to make sure that we don't fall behind, because if we fall behind, that means that we're likely going to spend more money, or well, in most cases, we spend more money in one way or another, or we might be missing some new features, some new security features, for example. One example for staying up to date is, for example, the new instance types for virtual machines that come out every, I don't know, maybe once a year, maybe a couple of times a year. And usually new instance types, even though from a compute point of view, they might be very similar, same amount of virtual CPU, same amount of memory, they might be cheaper. So one thing I always say is review what you've deployed and compare that with what is today true. Yeah, so what has been true a while ago might not be true today. That also means that possibilities are almost limitless in the cloud. So you can pretty much do whatever you want and build whatever you want and make sure that you're always up to date. But it also means and that's where the whole Spider-Man quote comes in that you've probably heard a lot of times. With this almost limitless power in the cloud comes a lot of responsibility, because nobody's going to stop you by default to spend a lot of money. Yeah, so we need to make sure that we always review what we've done. The other thing, I just want to give a few examples of other patterns or use cases that are very, very common, especially for cloud migrations, that in the cloud can be very different. And one of them is our jump box. Yeah, we've probably all heard of RDS gateways or terminal server gateways, or bastion hosts, and they're very common. They are usually deployed into a DMZ or into some similar networking structure. But Microsoft Azure has a service that does exactly that. So instead of us spending time and money on figuring out how to deploy a jump box and make it highly available and secure it and patch it and all of these things, there's now a new pattern where we can deploy a single resource that covers that whole use case, that whole scenario of securely and remotely accessing our environment for a fraction of the cost. It's a fully managed service. And if we hadn't reviewed that pattern, we wouldn't have known about this new pattern. Another one is Active Directory. Obviously, a lot of machines are domain joined, but for that to happen, we don't necessarily have to deploy domain controllers anymore in Azure. So there's Azure Active Directory domain services, which is essentially Microsoft deploying domain controllers on your behalf, but you don't have to deploy any virtual machines yourself. So if you just need to domain join virtual machines, then instead of figuring out how to deploy domain controllers by yourself, you might be able to go and just use this managed service. So really the point is, unlike a lot of on-premises environments that have been deployed years ago, and if it works, don't touch it. Yeah, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. In the cloud, things don't have to be broken to fall into the category of we should maybe review this thing and figure out if we can do it differently. The third tip is around strategy. Obviously, a good plan is already worth half the project. And if we know why we're going to the cloud and what the intent behind the project is, then it's much easier for people to buy in. We know what the target is. We know overall why we're doing things. So why are we going to the cloud? Could be, well, there's this one application and the hardware it is running on is end of life, or maybe it's a brand new application. And instead of sticking it into our on-premises data center, we figured out that there's a really good service by Microsoft that would fit this application really well, and we're going to deploy it into the cloud. So it's a single disconnected workload. Most companies nowadays probably go for hybrid cloud, where your on-premises environment is somehow connected to the cloud environment. Another option could be we're going all in to the cloud. We cancelled, or we've given our data center provider notice, we're going out. So that's something that we see more and more happening, where companies go through a full data center exit program, where they now have to figure out and identify how to go from on-premises all into the cloud. And for that, and for each of those strategies or scenarios, I always say maybe consider a phased migration approach, and not on Monday you're on-prem and have nothing, and on Tuesday, big bang, you're in the cloud. So a phased migration approach, especially for hybrid cloud, or where you identified a couple of workloads that are supposed to move to the cloud, is always good. And there's a couple of services, and I want to just mention Azure Migrate, that can help you with that strategy, that can help you identify if maybe certain workloads on premises can be transformed to app services, for example. We come across a lot of customers that run internal applications on IIS web servers, for example, or have WCF Windows services deployed on Windows servers. And a lot of these could run inside of Azure App Services. And Azure Migrate can help you identify these services and help you identify and formulate the strategy, a roadmap to migrating them over. Same goes for database assessments or migrations. Azure Migrate, you can point it at databases and then understand what the best approach would be for these databases. Should they go onto a SQL database or a SQL managed instance, or for whatever reason, you have to run it on a virtual machine. We read a lot about full transformation, digital transformation, and serverless and containers. However, you can think of it as unfortunately or fortunately, whatever it is, but a lot of cloud environments still run on virtual machines. So Azure Migrate, you can point it at your virtual machine hypervisors, for example, and it can tell you, it can help you build a dependency map of your applications, which is absolutely going to help you plan this phased migration approach, because you don't want to end up migrating virtual machine A to the cloud which was dependent on virtual machine B, but you didn't know about that because it was hard-coded in a hosts file or something, and people completely forgot that that happened years ago. And now you migrated VMA over to the cloud, and you just broke the application on VMA. So a service like Migrate can definitely help you understand dependencies inside of your environments. A really big one as well is governance and security, obviously, I think, because we're now running essentially on the internet. Cloud means we can access it from everywhere. The management platform, so the Azure console is exposed to the internet. So we need to make sure that it's all secure. So we need to figure out and almost write down how teams are going to use Azure. So what are and what aren't they allowed to do? Because cloud should not be a free-for-all for everybody. There's really good reasons why not. A lot of them are around compliance policies. So you might be constrained by PCI or SOX, or it could also just be data sovereignty policies that dictate that you cannot go and deploy any data outside of Australia, for example, or outside of the EU. And all of these rules can be defined on Azure. So for example, I mentioned this here, we can have tagging policies, or we can only allow specific regions or virtual machine sizes or database sizes to be deployed. And we can then use these policies and map them against regulatory compliance rules. So Azure Security Center is one of these built-in security services on Azure that can even tell you how compliant are you from an infrastructure point of view against PCI DSS or the CIS level 1 or 2. So that's really, really valuable. We have customers that use Security Center compliance during their official PCI audits, for example. So the auditors for those customers accept Microsoft Azure Security Center's report as proof that they are or are not compliant with certain rules. It's also important to not create bottlenecks. So whenever you make something too hard for the sake of just making it too hard, because security, so it's always just the because security, but there's no other reason, then people are either not going to use the platform, or you just force them somewhere else. And eventually people, we as humans, we always find a way to get to where we need to go. So if you just squeeze all of this, all of the fun out of using the Azure platform for your developers or system administrators or cloud ops engineers, then eventually they will stop using it. It's an unfortunate fact. All of these policies, they can also just be configured to run in audit mode instead of enforcing the policies. So you can go and have a conversation with people. So instead of blocking people from doing something, you can deploy these policies, deploy these rules, and then have conversations with people and talk to them. Going back to the very first tip, talk to people, understand why are they doing things the way they are doing them, because there's usually a really good reason why people are doing certain things. So you can go and use these reports and then have conversations with people about actual facts. Tip number 5 is know your environment. So if you don't know the initial state of your current environment, then how are you going to control the end state? So you really need to understand what you're currently moving. What dependencies do the things have that you're going to move? I mentioned Azure Migrate, which can help you understand if you move one application, is that going to break another one because they're talking to each other, but it's sort of hidden, or somebody deployed an application onto a virtual machine that wasn't supposed to be used for that application, but because that was the one that was available, they did anyways, didn't tell anybody. Suddenly that's a critical application, and you just moved it and broke the critical application. So Azure Migrate can help with that. It's also important to know, is the environment that you're moving even supported on your target platform on Azure? And that can be OS versions. Certain operating systems are just not supported. Windows Server 2000. Windows Server 2003 is not supported, but it works. Just FYI, if you still have Windows Server 2003, you should really get off it, but you can still deploy your custom VHD files with Windows Server 2003. But certain vendors just say, our application is not supported on Azure. They might have a reason for it. They might also just go and say, we haven't tested it, so we don't support it. So it's really important to know before you start moving it. It's also sometimes that they require a static MAC address on their network interfaces, which can be achieved, but it can be also quite a pain to get to that. Or certain applications are just not allowed to run on shared infrastructure. And now that we have dedicated hosts, that can kind of go away. But again, it all comes back to have a conversation to your vendor and understand, does my vendor for this application support running this application on Azure? And then this can creep up in a lot of tips. Right size your servers. So I mentioned in one of the other tips that Azure is not going to stop you from spending money, because why would Azure do that? Because you might have a reason for deploying the thing that you just deployed. So it's not going to stop you from doing that, which means that you need to look at your environment and make decisions around virtual machine sizes or database sizes or other things. Because whenever I go and have a conversation to customers and look at their hypervisors, for example, on Hyper-V or VMware or Xen or whatever it is, then by default, almost every virtual machine has at least, 4 virtual CPUs and 8 or maybe even 16 gigs of RAM nowadays. And why is that? Because people ask for a virtual machine and they just shrug and say 4 CPUs and 8 gig or 16 gig, and nobody questions it because it doesn't really cost money, because CapEx, the data center, has already been paid off, or the hardware was paid by somebody else. So you're really just the consumer of somebody else's expenditure. However, in the cloud, all of that changes. So where on premises, you've already paid for the hardware, and if your virtual machine just idles about, completely flatlines, and nothing really happens, it doesn't matter too much, as long as you're not hogging compute that other people might need. It doesn't necessarily matter too much. In the cloud, the more compute you ask for, the more you have to pay, whether you're using it or not. So keep the cost down by right sizing before you move. And again, Azure Migrate can help you with that. So I mentioned that really with cloud, and that's true for any cloud, this can become a bit philosophical, but really the whole idea of a DMZ is gone. There's no air gapping Azure. Yeah, everybody can browse to portal.azure.com and try to log in, which means that to log into your Azure environment, you need your Azure AD account, and then it's absolutely not up for debate. You have to use MFA. You have to use multi-factor authentication. There's zero chance I'm ever going to have that conversation with my customers if they want to start arguing about, but maybe we can just exempt a few of us. Not a conversation. You have to make identity a key part of the migration. Because if you don't use MFA, then all I need to figure out is your password. And then I am in your account. And then I have all the access that you have. And chances are, if you are one of the first people setting up the whole Azure infrastructure, you probably have a lot of privileges, maybe even global administrator permissions, and then I just own your environment. So we might use MFA has to become a we will use MFA. Very important. Active Directory Connect then also helps you with single sign-on by synchronizing your on-premises identity with Azure Active Directory. There's certain ways of synchronizing passwords or the password hashes where you want to have the authentication actually take place. Yeah, if you're not comfortable with having passwords actually synchronized up to the cloud, that's absolutely fine. You can move authentication down to on-prem against your domain controllers. Something that's always a big conversation is just enough permissions. It's very easy to go and give people a lot of permissions. It's very difficult to keep permissions at a minimum. So the one role on Azure Active Directory that I always go and review from the get-go is global administrators, because they are like your domain administrators. Even if your global admin doesn't have any access to your Azure subscriptions, so any of your virtual machines, they can just go and take that access. They can give themselves access to your subscriptions. Microsoft even goes and in the Azure portal will give you a warning if you have too many global administrators. There are some good documents out there on the Azure documentation that have best practices around global administrators and how to secure them, how to make sure you've got the best practices around break glass accounts, etc. Another good example for just enough permissions is by just removing everybody's write access to production. So the only way to actually deploy something into production is by using deployment pipelines. in which case we go into the whole CI/CD DevOps topic, which for some customers might be a bit premature, but most of our customers follow this production is read-only access model. Which goes into modernization. And there are a couple of misconceptions when it comes to cloud, especially with people that haven't really used cloud before. And the first one is a very big one. So just because a virtual machine or anything runs on Azure, insert any other cloud provider, that doesn't mean that it's suddenly backed up or more secure, highly available, automated, or even cheaper than what it was on-prem. If you lift and shift without doing anything to those virtual machines, if you just move them over to the cloud, then there's a really big chance that you're actually making your environment less secure, less available, less automated, and probably more expensive than it was. That's not to use the whole FUD approach here, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but just to highlight that Microsoft by default doesn't go and back your virtual machines up. They're not automatically more secure. Yeah, if anything, they're probably less secure because you can just go and slap a public IP onto a virtual machine and everybody can go and access it if they have the credentials to log in. So making sure that you follow a transformation light, or as we call it, a contemporary lift and shift approach, can make your environment a lot more modern without impacting the actual applications. So that means automate the deployment. You don't need to have a site A in Melbourne and a site B in Sydney just as a failover site. That's not how you do cloud. In some cases, in some scenarios, that might be something you have to do depending on the application, but as a blanket approach, you're just going to pay a lot of money and you're not going to use the cloud for what it is. So if you can automate the infrastructure deployment, you've already gone a long way. If you right size, as I mentioned before, then you're going to save quite a bit of money. So I always go and just deploy the smallest possible virtual machine size. And a lot of people raise their eyebrows when I say that at customer sites, we're just going to deploy the absolute smallest virtual machine, 1 CPU, 2 gigs of RAM, and let's see what happens. Because if it doesn't work, it's a click of a button and you have more power. So going in small, saving money is a lot better than just going with what you've already got because it always worked, in quotes. There are also patterns around availability sets or availability zones now in Australia available, or even virtual machine scale sets, where you don't actually have to go and change anything in your application, but by using some foundational infrastructure patterns provided to you by Microsoft, and all of them are free. Availability sets, zones, and scale sets are absolutely free unless you go and deploy multiple machines. You just pay for the actual virtual machines, but the underlying functionality is free. And that can give you higher availability than what you would have gotten if you just deployed a single virtual machine. Very important. And for example, availability sets, you can't put a virtual machine into an availability set once you have deployed that virtual machine. something that a lot of people trip over, where we come in to do a review of an infrastructure, and I go and say, well, none of these virtual machines are in an availability set. So if Microsoft has to go and patch the hypervisor, your VM is going to go down. So if you had to put it into an availability set, maybe with another virtual machine, then this would have happened in sequence. So your application, your VM would have still worked. Which all means really just apply modern practices instead of continuing with old ones. Here, again, it's a different mindset. What works on premises is likely still going to work in the cloud, but might not be the best fit. I think Gartner came up with the 5 R's of cloud migrations, rehost, so that's really just your lift and shift. Refactor means maybe some of these applications that you have or workloads can go into a container or into Azure Functions or Logic apps, all of these things. So take the application and do something to it and put it somewhere else. Revise is a bit of a mix between lift and shift and so rehosting and refactoring by removing blockers to refactoring. Rebuild obviously means just start from scratch and replace. Maybe you've built your own application or an application 10 years ago. Somebody programmed that in-house, but now in 2020, there's somebody who offers the same service or a similar service as a service, like a SaaS offering. So you can just pay somebody to do it, and you just consume that service. Replace can also mean just turn it off. Nobody actually uses it anymore. I usually apply the screen test in these cases. So if people go and just shrug their shoulders when I ask, what's that virtual machine there for? And they say, I don't know. We apply the screen test and just turn it off and see who screams. And then we go and ask, and if nobody screams, it just stays turned off. Tip number 8, keep up to date. And I mentioned in the cloud, things change all the time. Most Azure product groups work on a fortnightly sprint, some of them on 3 weeks, I think. But that means that most services deploy new features very, very regularly. And that doesn't mean that every 2 weeks there's a couple of hundred new features, but it really means that in reality, yesterday some services deployed some features, and today some other services deployed some new features. They light up in certain regions, depending on how they roll out. It really means you need to keep learning. You need to keep up to date, because if you don't keep up to date, you're going to miss new features or new patterns. And new features or patterns can mean that you can shift some of your responsibility to Microsoft. So instead of worrying about how to deploy an RDS gateway, which really nobody at your company is ever going to make money with. Yeah, RDS gateways don't make companies money unless you're a partner that deploys RDS gateways for customers. But you can go and just focus on the exciting things, security and deployments and the operational aspects, or developing new applications, and just use Azure Bastion to replace these jump boxes. Same goes for patch management. Azure Automation has a feature for update management, where it's almost a WSUS or Windows Server Update Services as a service. And the really, really cool thing about cloud is that it's really easy to just go and test things out. So just be brave. In a lot of cases, it really doesn't take long to just test something. Just deploy a new test environment somewhere, test a feature. If it works, awesome. Yeah, go and talk to somebody, show them what you've just tested, and maybe make it a thing. If it doesn't work, delete it and move on. In most cases, you might have spent, I don't know, maybe $50 to test something out that could have potentially saved your company thousands or maybe tens of thousands of dollars in just TCO, in total cost of ownership. Because again, I'm always going back to the jump boxes. Just figuring out how to deploy them and patch them and make them highly available, back them up if they have to be backed up. All of these things, that's time, that's money to deploy these virtual machines or services. That's you spending time, which means you spending money that you could just go and deploy Azure Bastion, which I think is $70 a month. So if you as a company, you have a pattern for jump boxes, which we, by the way, had, and we now completely scrapped it because of that service. And you can spend less than $70 on your pattern, great, but it's probably unlikely, which is why we're now telling all our customers, or most of our customers, to use Azure Bastion, because it fits the use case and fits the modernization pattern. Tip number 9, and we're getting close to the end now. So is data, data, and data. Microsoft, seriously, they published some numbers a while ago, and some of them they have trillions of data points that they collect per month, I think, or even per day, like an absurd amount of data that they collect across all of their customers. And most of that data is being made available for you for free. So everything that happens on the Azure platform, you go and click something, or I go and delete something, I make a change, all of that has been logged and audited, and it's there for free to be used. So implement a monitoring framework and a process that is there. Yeah, so Azure Monitor hooks into Azure Log audit logs and Azure Log Analytics workspaces. All of these things have minimal cost associated to them, or sometimes no cost at all. If you do want to go with a third-party product, I always tell my customers, use a third-party monitoring framework or process that actually knows the cloud. And it's not just something that hooks into one API and pulls out 5 data points or something. Yeah, you're just spending a lot of money on a tiny subset of what Azure already gives you for free. If you're not collecting any of this data, and if you're not actually making use of that data by looking at it, then you're never going to be able to make your applications better. If you don't look at metrics, how much CPU are my virtual machines actually using, who is accessing, from where, all of these things, all of that data is there for you to use and act on. Yeah, security, out of the box, you can see where are people connecting from. You can respond to these login events. You can look at your governance stance, like I said, and compare it to other compliance frameworks. And in the end, you can even go and hook all of this data up to Power BI, a analytics service by Microsoft, to see all of this data in context. There's a cost associated to that, of course, but it's there. Use the data, make sure you look at the data and use it for your advantage. And in the end, it's sort of my big thing. Tip number 10, go all in. So you've chosen Azure, which I believe is a really good choice. And I come from, I believe, from a point of experience, having worked for a very long time on both of the two big cloud providers. So you've chosen Azure, congratulations, it's a really good choice. And now go all in. Don't just use tiny bits and pieces. Don't just use virtual machines for as another hosting platform, because you're missing out on a lot of potential. Which means you're missing out on a lot of features that can actually make you way more productive. For example, instead of putting PowerShell scripts onto Windows servers to run as scheduled tasks, they can now go into Azure Functions. If you move to that Windows server to a virtual machine, you're probably spending $300, $400, $500 a month for a scheduled task. Whereas if you put it into an Azure function, it's most likely not going to cost you anything at all. So use it to its fullest and not just as another hosting platform. And this is now a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Multi-cloud, it seems to be a big thing now, more and more. And people say, oh, we can't go into only one cloud, we have to be multi-cloud, which I always question. And so far, I've not had a single customer. And full disclosure, I've not worked with every company on this planet, obviously, but I have not had a customer actually show me written down somewhere in law that told them they have to be on multiple cloud providers. So the thing is, if you go into multiple public clouds, which multi-cloud usually means, then you're really reducing your cloud to the lowest common denominator across all of these clouds, which usually means just a virtual machine. And that's even sometimes not even possible, because the implementation of virtual machines in one cloud is very different to the implementation of virtual machines on another cloud. So you're actually going to spend way more money just trying to figure out how to do multi-cloud, and then spending more money because you're limiting yourself to just using a very, very small subset of the actual cloud features. I have seen multi-cloud work if it's being used very strategically, where a company might have said, on this platform, the data and analytics service is really powerful, and we're going to use it for that. And on this other platform, the database services are really, really attractive to us because of cost and functionality. So we're going to use it over there. But then having one workload at the same time for high availability on multiple clouds, which is usually what people think about when they say multi-cloud, is usually a really, really stretch goal, which I've not seen work personally. However, some people also think about multi-cloud in a concept of hybrid, which Azure with Azure Stack, for example, makes really, really simple now, where you can even go and deploy one infrastructure as code template, so as a resource manager template, the same into the public cloud and the on-premises Azure Stack cloud. So Microsoft does believe in hybrid cloud very, very strongly. And we've seen customers be very successful using Azure Stack on premises, or even without Azure Stack, using some of the newer features on Azure to manage on-premises or even other cloud provider virtual machines from Azure through a single pane of glass. So these were my 10 tips really to be successful. And I know they weren't very, very technical. It's one of my least technical talks, to be honest. But I see a lot of customers struggle with actually getting started and moving their mindset and shifting this mindset more towards, okay, cloud is not just a different hypervisor we deploy to, but the way we interact with it is going to change and needs to change for us to be successful. I've got one important resource that I want to mention, and that's the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's something that I recommend a lot of our customers to read. You can find it on aka.ms/CAF. And that's where Microsoft has a lot of best practices, a lot of approaches and strategies lined out for you to adopt and then adopt the cloud going forward. With that, we have come to the end of my talk. And just as a reminder, my name is David O'Brien. You can find me here on Twitter and on my blog. And with that, thank you very much for dialing in. And I'm going to hand over to Nadia now, because she has a few other things to say. And I'm going to dive into the Q&A section now.
Thank you for that, David. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today's session. For those who don't know, my name is Nadia. I'm the Community Engagement and Event Manager for the Reactor here in Sydney. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'm just going to give David some time to go through them while I take you through our events. So if you want to find out more of the events we have up and coming, as you may have come across our meetup page, you can find us at Microsoft Reactor Sydney and also our Twitter page as well. It shares not only our local content, but as well as our global as well. So we've got an event coming up this week on the 4th of June called Building Loosely Coupled Serverless Solutions with Azure Event Grid. The session's going to be delivered by Simon Waite, who is an Azure Pro developer lead. So he's going to take you through some demos and how you can, show how we can quickly add new handlers to serverless apps without needing to modify publishers. We have another session called Building Apps Super Fast Using the Microsoft Graph Toolkit. So with this session here, there's one requirement, which is just basic HTML is all that's required. So in this session, you'll learn what Microsoft Graph is and how to write your first Graph-powered web app. We have another session as well called the Unobtrusive Power Platform DevOps Pipeline. So have you ever wondered how you can completely automate a DevOps Power Platform pipeline? This session is going to answer questions around that with demos to truly appreciate what's possible with Azure DevOps and Power Platform. So the last two sessions will be delivered by a few of our MVPs in the community. So there'll be great sessions, so don't miss out. You'll be able to register for them on the Microsoft Reactor Sydney meetup page. If you've got any feedback for today's session, you'll be able to give the feedback here at aka.ms/reactor/survey. They do ask for an event code, so I popped it up on the screen for you, and I'll also pop it in the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over back to David to answer some of your questions.
Thanks, Nadia. All right, so first question is, What would you say is the most effective method of training for Azure migration? What did you find most helpful during this period? The most effective method really was to get our customers along the ride and not go away after having have a chat to them and then do things in a black box and then say after X weeks, here, there you go, and good luck with it. It's to take them along the journey. And from an actual training point of view, there's some really good Microsoft Learn trainings, which are completely free of charge. So Nadia, maybe we can put that into the session notes later on, some links to the Microsoft Learn content, where there's the fundamentals training, which usually builds towards the AZ900 Azure fundamentals training. Sorry, I'm also a Microsoft trainer. That's why I'm mentioning this whole training thing. So that's usually something, getting the fundamentals right, getting them along the journey, and most helpful is really understanding that cloud is very different, and being from our end empathetic with concerns around cloud, and understanding that it is a mental journey just as much as a technical journey for a lot of people. So on the receiving end, for our customers, I always say, be open to change, be curious, question what happens, but also go and spend some time on Microsoft Learn, because they really have some really good content there. Right, thank you for that question. Steve has another question. Great session, thank you. We're about to migrate over to Azure, so perfect timing for this live stream. Can I ask, what did you find most challenging migrating to Azure, and how did you overcome it? Is there a step you would do differently? So battle stories. There's been a few very legacy applications that customers wanted us to migrate. Some of them required mapping folders into user profiles while the server was coming up after boot, so they could go and run certain scripts that were required by an application that only ran in the user context, which is absolutely non-cloudy. And in the end, we somehow got it working. It was super hacky, and if you were to look at the code, you would probably say this is an awesome solution, but at the same time, why would you ever do that? And is there a step you would do differently? Yes, absolutely. I would have pushed, now in hindsight, would have pushed harder for transformation of this application, because it was a really good candidate for transformation, to put it into a different Azure service, which would have saved money and would have made it much more modern without the hack solution. Because a while later, after we disengaged with the customer, so after the migration was done, I learned that the application actually had a big outage because this hack just couldn't survive an update at some point, and the application was down for a while. So yeah, I would probably in that case have, now in hindsight, should have pushed a bit harder. Cloud adoption framework. Okay, John asks, is Azure Migrate using ASR as a backend, or are there any differences with ASR when looking at migration methods. So in this context, ASR is Azure Site Recovery, and is another service by Azure. And yeah, Azure Migrate, there are differences when it comes to if it uses it as a backend or not. I'm actually not sure. And in my opinion, it also really doesn't matter too much because it's a managed service. So what they're using in the end can maybe sometimes be interesting for the technical mind, but from an outcome point of view, it really doesn't matter, in my opinion. But other differences with ASR when looking at migration methods. Yeah, so Azure Migrate will tell you a lot more when it comes, or when you get to the assessment phase and actually trying to understand what the applications require, about right sizing, about dependency mapping, about assessment. Can we go and put these applications into an app service, or which databases to use? So Azure Migrate is a lot more mature when it comes to the assessment phase. And I believe that Microsoft also now says that ASR really shouldn't be used, and I might be wrong. I'm not too familiar with ASR. We don't use ASR that much, or I haven't used it in quite a while, actually. But I think the official guidance now is to use Migrate for migrations instead of ASR. All right, I think those were all the questions that I can see. Are there any other questions? So I don't think I can see anything else. Cool, in which case, yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. I hope you got a lot out of this session. And as before, if you want to have a chat about any of this, I'm happy to get back to you on Twitter or on my blog or any of the other social media platforms that I'm on.
Thank you for that, David. I've also popped David's contact details, his Twitter handle and blog in the chat as well, if you did miss that earlier. But thank you so much, David, for jumping on and taking us through the 10 successful tips for Azure migration.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you. We'll see you next time.